Welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about life in the software-driven world and how it's vaporizing many physical objects. We'll explain what that means in just a moment. My very special guest today is Robert Tercek. Mr. Tercek is a former executive of MTV Networks, Sony Pictures Entertainment, and the Oprah Winfrey Network. Additionally, he is a digital pioneer and he has successfully launched numerous online products and services. Welcome, Robert, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Dave. It's good to be here.
Well, we have a lot to talk about and not very much time, but before we start our main conversation, I want to first introduce your book to the audience. It's called Vaporized, and I had a chance to read the book. It's a compelling read, and there's lots of thought-provoking information in this book, and it challenges the reader to really rethink a lot of the paradigms that we've been operating within over the last several decades. So anyway, with that, let's go ahead and get started on this concept of vaporization. Now, I said physical products are being vaporized. That doesn't mean that they're literally going poof like a magician in Las Vegas, but it does mean that certain physical objects are being replaced by software over time.
That's exactly right. That's the premise of the book. So when I say vaporize, it's a metaphor, of course, but there is an element of like, wow, there was something here and it just disappeared. An example of that is in the first 3 months of this year, 9 major retail chains went out of business. Nine big national retailers disappeared. So those are shops where you might drive by the mini mall or the big mall, and you'd see that sign, you'd see that store, you'd see all the cars parked out in front, and then one day, lo and behold, all you see is a sign that says everything must go, and a month later, there's nothing there. And so this process is a strange one because things are disappearing. We're replacing them with software, but the software is invisible, so it's hard for us to track, it's hard for us to measure, it's hard for us to see or understand it. We can't really perceive it because it's outside of our senses. That's what makes it such a fascinating phenomenon.
Well, if you take a look at the smartphone, for example, the smartphone has replaced the camera, it's replaced the video recorder, it's replaced the compass and the map and the calculator and the alarm clock and probably some other things I can't think off the top of my head.
About 25 things are now just built into the phone. So it means you don't buy them anymore. And by the way, the companies that used to make those things, those were formidable companies. Remember in the early 80s, everyone was worried about the Japanese giants, the electronics giants from Japan. Well, now those companies are in serious trouble. They're having real difficulty making a profit because they've experienced double-digit decreases in the sales of things like digital cameras, GPS units, voice recorders, MP3 players. All that stuff you used to have to buy, you don't carry it around anymore. So in the last 10 years, we've seen an enormous drop in the number of people buying those consumer electronics devices, while there's been an incredible surge in the number of people who are buying smartphones.
Well, there are consequences to this concept of vaporization, and one of those consequences is how it may affect the GDP if we're no longer manufacturing, producing, and selling the kinds of products we've been talking about here. So what is the impact on the GDP, and does the GDP going forward really measure what the economy is all about?
It's a super good question. It's a hard one to answer. So the GDP measures a basket of goods. Now the fact is, if you don't buy those goods anymore, if you get out of the habit of buying those things, then the GDP is going to go down, right? That's just a function of the way that that particular metric is designed. So let's say you don't buy a digital camera and you don't buy a video recorder and you don't buy a DVD player and you no longer have to buy an MP3 player because all that stuff comes free when you buy a smartphone. So you purchase one smartphone, but you stop purchasing maybe a half dozen to 2 dozen electronics devices. That's going to affect the GDP in a funny way, kind of a paradoxical way, because it means we're actually spending less on those other products. GDP goes down, even as people are getting better value out of their phones. So it's a good thing for consumers. It's a tough thing for those electronics companies. But in general, GDP would reflect this as a drop in the GDP. And that seems like a negative thing, when in fact it's clearly an unquestionably good thing for consumers.
Well, if we talk about the industrial economy, the economy that we've all become familiar with since World War II, and the World Trade Arrangement, the Pacific Rim and so forth, where things have been manufactured in China and put on ships and sent over here across the ocean. We put them on trains at the port of Long Beach and the port of LA and send them across the country via trains, and then they end up on trucks, warehouses, and in the stores. Now, if that paradigm is shifting and slowly coming to an end as we know it, What are the consequences for the workers? We hear a lot about automation and robotics replacing workers. Now we're talking about the products themselves being vaporized or disappearing. What are those consequences going forward?
Well, there are quite a few, a large number of consequences, and strangely, it's a topic you don't hear our politicians debate much, and frankly, I wish it would come up more because it's a very urgent issue. You know, in the beginning I talked about those 9 retail chains closing. 89,000 jobs were eliminated when those retail chains closed this year. So that's since President Trump was elected. 89,000 jobs have been eliminated in the retail sector. Now, during the campaign, Trump spent a lot of time talking about coal and saving coal jobs. Well, more jobs were lost in the last 3 months in retail than all of the coal mining jobs that he hopes to save. Where's the focus on this issue? Why haven't our politicians come around to dealing with the consequences of automation, software automation, and robotics in general? And by the way, I use the 2 terms interchangeably, automation and robotics. The reason I do that, we see a lot of videos of robots. They're very impressive. They're very intimidating in some respects. But all a robot is just a physical manifestation of software. The software that controls it is really the valuable part. Software automation is eliminating a lot more jobs than robots. It's much bigger, but because it's totally invisible, we can't see it. We don't tend to observe it or notice it as much. But software automation has eliminated enormous numbers of jobs.
And I want to pick up on that theme because we've been focusing on, when we talk about manufacturing and industrialization and so on, we tend to focus on the so-called blue-collar jobs and also the Rust Belt, quote-unquote Rust Belt jobs. But those are not the only jobs that are vulnerable to vaporization. There are jobs and there are industries that are considered to be white-collar industries that are also under threat. What are some of those industries?
Without a doubt, it's very true. So again, you hear a lot of noise about manufacturing jobs. The reality is we've been spending the last 30 years outsourcing and downsizing and offshoring and eliminating and de-skilling jobs as much as we possibly can in the manufacturing sector, such that today manufacturing jobs represent less than 10% of the total jobs in the United States. It's still an important part of the economy, don't get me wrong, but we've already eliminated a lot of those jobs. The jobs that now are being changed are white-collar jobs and service-level jobs. And so one example you'll notice, if you go to a Home Depot, or frankly a lot of grocery stores now, or drugstores, you'll notice there aren't very many checkout personnel. There aren't people at the checkout counter. There isn't even a checkout counter in some places. There's just a self-service kiosk to check out. So those are jobs that have been eliminated. And after the 2008 economy kind of went into the tank there, in the recovery period, the fastest area where we were adding the most jobs was in exactly those kinds of jobs. So the first ones to come back, the first jobs that we created after the crash, are the first jobs to be eliminated by software. And again, you don't hear a lot of discussion about this. We always focus on manufacturing, but that's kind of a thing of the past at this point. When manufacturing does come back on these shores, it'll be largely robotically done. It'll be done mostly by machines and a very few in number human technicians. Those will be great jobs, high-paid, high-skill jobs. But the idea of like employing large numbers of people to do manual labor in a factory, I think that's an idea of the past. This strikes China much harder than it strikes the United States, by the way.
And I want to mention a quote by Jack Ma, who is the co-founder of Alibaba in China, which is the Chinese equivalent of Amazon.com. It's an online retailer. And Jack Ma was recently speaking to an entrepreneurship conference in China, and he said, quote, "In the next 30 years, the world will see much more pain than happiness. Social conflicts in the next 3 decades will have an impact on all sorts of industries and walks of life." And are we talking about social upheaval here, and are we prepared for it, and can we soften the blow?
You could argue we've already seen the social upheaval here in the last election, one of the nastiest political disputes we've seen in a long time, in our lifetime. So certainly we're experiencing some social upheaval here, but that's not all. I think when you take Jack Ma's message, remember his point of reference is China. And in China, in the last 30 years, has absorbed an awful lot of the manufacturing jobs that we offshored from the United States. What's happening now in China is that they're moving to robotics as fast as they possibly can. Now, there's a big difference between the Chinese economy and the United States. We have a safety net. You could argue that our safety net has some holes in it, no question about that. That's a fair point. In China, they simply don't have one. And so if you displace workers there is no safety net for them. And so imagine you've had hundreds of millions of people move from the center of China, from rural villages, to coastal cities. If those people are displaced, you have rootless young people without jobs. That's a recipe for social unrest. I think that's what Jack Ma is referring to.
All right, well, let's talk about vaporization of a particular industry that we're all aware of. When you and I were kids, we all had Kodak cameras,
Yeah.
and we all shot Kodak film, either Kodachrome or Ektachrome or some variation of that. We also had movie cameras, Super 8 film cameras. We shot our home movies on Super 8 film. Well, Kodak was sitting high on the world, I guess, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 1980s. But one of the things that Kodak did not realize until it was probably too late was that their stock and trade and what their expertise involved was the constituencies of color and what color is all about. And so we no longer have the film, we no longer have the cameras, we no longer have the chemicals for processing film and that kind of thing, but it's all about color, and that transfers over to the digital camera and digital photography realm. And so that's an example, I guess, of what you talk about in the book in terms of companies needing to make the transition from physical objects and physical products and thinking about data, because the constituencies of color involves data. What about that? Do you think that's a good analogy?
Kodak's a great example. So, you know, Kodak is a great example in a couple of surprising ways. First of all, it's not like they were unaware of the threat from digital technology. They were well aware of it. And Nick Negroponte, when he wrote the introduction to my book, he mentioned that he went to Kodak and said, look, you've got to deal with this. Well, it turns out Kodak has an enormous number of patents around digital imaging. So they were quite aware of it. They were inventing around it. Well, the mistake they made was, that so many companies make, is that they had a very mature product at the peak of its game. You know, in the 1980s, Kodak was absolutely dominant in the film business, and their product was very mature. It was excellent, and arguably the best imaging product we've ever had in society. Well, it's very hard at that pinnacle to imagine you're going to be supplanted in such a short period of time. And what they couldn't see and they couldn't imagine is that the smartphone capabilities would get so good so fast. You know, the smartphone doubles and doubles and doubles in its capabilities. So it starts out very poor. You know, in 2000, when your first camera phone came out, it didn't have very good resolution. The images were candidly terrible. So it was pretty easy to not take it seriously in 2000, 2001, and 2002. But gradually, that phone got better and better until 2010. It's only a 10-year interval. And by 2010, it was now competitive with the low-end cameras, and that's when we saw a massive displacement.
All right, well, let's talk about the automotive industry, because this is another place where we're starting to see a lot of changes. We all know about the self-driven cars that Google is experimenting with and some other companies as well. We only have about a minute before the break, but if you can encapsulate it within a minute, what is the future of the auto industry in addition to the self-driving cars?
In my view, the car industry of the future is going to look a lot like the PC industry or the mobile phone industry, in the sense that there won't be a lot of value in the physical hardware. It'll be a lot more value in the software. The companies that seem to understand this best, unfortunately, aren't in Detroit or in Germany. They're in Silicon Valley. And so the smart technology companies are now looking at the car like a giant rolling smartphone, and they're developing the software that'll control all the digital services and the automation involved. The car companies, they remain focused on building physical cars. They're going to get stuck with the hardware. I wouldn't want to make that bet.
Okay, well, on that note, we do have to go to the break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation about vaporization in the data-driven economy. Stay tuned.
Should your company buy or sell? Expand or not? Relocate? Or simply stay the same? If you'd like to examine past and present predictions, integrating finances and people, and make future predictions based on all that information, a career in economics is for you. You can become a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Robert Tercek. And Robert, before we went to the break, we were talking about cars and the automotive industry and the fact that you had indicated that Silicon Valley is in the driver's seat, with the pun intended there, because Detroit still seems to be focused on the sheet metal and the tires and the gear shifts.
I think that's largely true. You know, in the book, in Vaporized, I describe how there's a hardware layer, but then there's a software layer on top of it, and whoever controls that software layer, the operating system typically in a computer, controls all the valuable services that come on top of it. You see that exactly in the smartphone, right? So in the smartphone, there's really two operating systems, Apple's, and they control the whole stack, and then Android, which is from Google. Now, they don't make the phones, really. They make the Pixel phones. Most of the Android phones are made by Chinese manufacturers or Korean manufacturers. Google controls all the services above that, and they're making an enormous amount of money. They're kind of taking the cream off of the milk, or the cheese off the pizza, I guess, in the smartphone business. So the question when you look at a car is you say, gee, is a car more like a smartphone in the future, where it has an operating system and artificial intelligence and then all kinds of valuable digital services on top and data that we can collect from all those drivers and where they're going? To me, that sounds an awful lot like Google's sweet spot, which makes sense then. It sort of explains why Google's investing so much effort into robot vehicles. They don't want to be a car manufacturer. I don't think they're really going to, in a big way, get into making cars or compete with Detroit. They just want to control the data layer and all the services on top. Now think about this from your own experience. The first time I heard about robot cars in a big way, not those DARPA competitions, but like a real effort to launch a robot vehicle, was about 2010. And at the time, my reaction, I remember very clearly, I was like, get out of here, it'll never happen, no way. And from a person with my perspective, that's kind of an unusual reaction to give. But I came around pretty quickly because smarter people started to explain to me that this is definitely something that was going to happen. That was 2010. My initial reaction then was, this is preposterous. By 2015, it became perfectly clear to me that this was going to be a thing. Here it is, 2017. Every major car company now has an autonomous vehicle division, and they're pursuing it with relentless focus. They have to, because there's so much competition. By 2020, this is going to seem quite normal. By 2025, I think it's going to become an accepted part of our day-to-day experience. We already have robot taxi services underway and testing in several cities in the US, in Singapore, in Tokyo, and elsewhere in Europe, in several cities. In about 20 cities around the world, they're testing robot taxis. So I think we're going to be conditioned to this being quite a normal thing within the next 10 years. It's amazing how fast that shift can happen.
Well, if we're talking about the cars being self-driven and communicating with other cars, which we're certainly talking about, but it's also the experience of being in an automobile is going to be completely different. It's now going to be stepping into an internet chamber, if you will.
That's true.
So you're going to conduct your work, you're going to watch a movie, you're going to get on Skype, you're going to catch up on some old notes that are available through a PowerPoint presentation that you can watch in the car.
Yeah, so instead of that white knuckle drive down the 405 freeway, bumper to bumper traffic, and people are trying to drink a coffee, you know, fumble around with their phone, that's quite dangerous, that scenario. This is a safer scenario because if you're only driving 10 miles an hour, why not let a robot take over if you're sitting in bumper to bumper traffic? And you can be more productive doing something with your full attention instead of partial attention. That's actually a safer scenario. But remember, we give up autonomy in that scenario. So we're releasing agency, we're relinquishing agency to the vehicle and to whomever designs the operating system and the rules that govern that vehicle. And that's a big shift that I think a lot of Americans haven't really thought through.
Well, you've also talked in the book about the fact that as we move into this data-driven and software-driven economy, that it's actually the data which becomes the most important asset. We talked about that with Kodak before the break, and the fact that they had this knowledge of digital imaging that they didn't fully take advantage of until it was probably too late. But all companies, according to what you've written in the book, will become more like info tech companies in the future. Why is that?
I think that's the case. Well, I believe, and I maintain in the book, I argue in Vaporized, that every business, every product, and frankly every employee in a company has a tremendous amount of knowledge embedded inside of itself, but we aren't very good at extracting that knowledge and systematizing and recording it. The companies that are the best at this are the internet companies. And so you could argue that a company like Google has built this kind of global, invisible information empire that spans the entire planet, rides on other people's telecommunication networks. They don't really own a lot of telecommunication equipment themselves. So they're leveraging investments that other companies made in telecoms to get to huge numbers of people. When you use your Google phone, they're tracking every single thing that you're doing. So they're recording every behavior that you have, your habits and so on. Not so much that they're trying to surveil you, that's the paranoid interpretation. What they're looking for is aggregate patterns from which they can generate new businesses. That's why Waze, which is a map application that they own, is so effective, because it's using the aggregate data from a lot of drivers to extract a pattern out, and they can make an intelligent recommendation to you. We get a lot of benefit as consumers. We get a tremendous amount of benefit. I think that's why so many of us willingly give up our information. We give it away for free. We don't even think twice about what we might be sacrificing in that exchange, because we get so many free benefits from Google. But we are giving up an awful lot, and I think it behooves people to pay a little closer attention to what exactly you're giving away in that exchange.
Well, I think that a lot of people have already accepted the fact that anytime we use the internet, we're being at least passively surveilled, perhaps by the government, and we're being actively and aggressively surveilled by marketers and advertisers. And you know as well as I do that if you're shopping for a product, let's say you're shopping for a flat screen TV, or it could be a refrigerator, or it could be a car. As soon as you start that search process, every time you turn on your computer, you're going to see pop-up ads about cars and about flat screen TVs and refrigerators. And so there is a lot of surveilling that's going on and a lot of data mining that's occurring behind the scenes at every touch of the keyboard. Is this something that we should just passively accept, or should there be more of a debate about this?
It's quite interesting that there hasn't been a debate, right? There has been a very lively debate in Europe, and particularly in places like Germany, where they know a few things about having a government that has a tremendous amount of knowledge about what people are doing, and the loss of autonomy, the loss of freedom that comes when you give up that kind of information. So certain countries are very concerned about it. But in the United States, we seem to be sleepwalking into a surveillance state. I'd argue we're already in it. What's weird about the surveillance state is it's not imposed upon us. We opt into it. It's an opt-in panopticon. It's something that we chose. We trade away information that we don't really pay attention to. We're frankly unaware of a lot of our own habits. But it's extremely valuable to someone else, and they offer us free email, free maps, other services, free messaging in exchange for keeping track of us. The companies that are extremely good at this, well, they're private businesses. They're not accountable to us. We're not their customer, really. We're the product. Their customer is the marketer. And they're selling our data with tremendous amounts of precision, far more data than you realize. Literally hundreds of data points about you and your behavior and what you do, how frequently you do it, and so forth, things that you can't even keep track of. That information is incredibly valuable to marketers. So there's a lively business being made, but be very clear, they are strip mining you and your behavior and your patterns and selling it to somebody else.
And if we can get beyond the concern or paranoia about surveillance, and it's not paranoia, it's reality, as you said, we can also acknowledge on the other side of the coin that we get a lot of benefit out of the internet. Sure. And the access to the internet, particularly when it comes to purchasing. Right. It's a lot harder for retailers to gouge consumers today because there is so much information available. You can always do price comparisons, price checking. You can also check for product reviews, and you can compare items online so that it saves a lot of legwork and a lot of headaches. Also, there's the sort of democratizing aspect of the internet through services like Yelp, and the opportunity for people to weigh in on a purchase or a product or an experience they had. And so does that sort of mitigate some of the other things that you've been talking about with the panopticon?
It does mitigate. It's a function of it, right? So the way I describe it in Vaporized is I say that we're creating marketplaces, and some of the marketplaces are very clear. So if you go on eBay, it's a marketplace for collectibles and tradable items. Amazon's a marketplace for all sorts of merchants and all sorts of goods. Information marketplaces like Google, when you do a Google search, it's absolutely a switchboard for information. You're looking for information, someone else is providing it, they connect you. Facebook is a switchboard or a marketplace for people who want to connect with other people. So there's many examples of this, but they're all built on the same concept, which is a marketplace. And free trade people love this, right? So people who are interested in neoliberal policy, they're like, great, that's the manifestation of the world that we like. It's a market, everyone's a free actor, they have total control. The reality is, no. That's not the case. When you opt into one of these marketplaces, you're playing by their rules. You don't make the rules. You don't get a chance to change them. They can change the rules anytime they want. They can change what information they're tracking on your mobile app anytime they want to. You really, as a consumer, don't have a lot of leverage here. These contracts of adhesion are what they're referred to as. You have very little leverage to bargain as an individual against a behemoth, a global company that imposes those rules upon you. And the other argument is, well, if you don't like that treatment, you can simply opt out. But really, can you opt out of social media? Can you opt out of email at this stage? Can you opt out of using a browser, opt out of using a search engine? It's 2017. I don't really think that's a viable opportunity for people.
Well, let's talk about the application ecosystem. And we know that there are three or four companies that are definitely in control of this at this point. And we've talked a lot about Google. There's also Amazon. There's also Apple. And we could throw in Facebook because they certainly have a strong
and Microsoft.
Input, and Microsoft.
Sure, and there's a number of companies. They all follow a similar model, but what's interesting about them is they have strategic diversity. So Apple's a good example because they're now the most valuable company in the world. Back in 2006, they weren't even on the list of the 10 most valuable companies. Today they dominate it, which is an extraordinary change. It's all because of the iPhone. The iPhone is the most successful product ever introduced, $1 trillion product. There are about 1.2 billion of them in use around the world right now. So Apple has that phone isn't just a piece of hardware. It's connected, thanks to the operating system, to a virtual store where they sell tremendous amounts of digital goods, digital services, the App Store, iTunes, Apple Music, Apple Pay, and so forth. Now, what's interesting about Apple is if you were to take out all the revenue from the iPhone, that's their biggest source of revenue. Their second biggest source of revenue is from intangibles, and from software. It's called services. That's how they break it out. Apple makes more money selling digital services than they make selling all of their computers. They make more money selling digital services than they make on all their iPads and any other hardware besides the iPhone. So Apple's second biggest source of revenue today isn't hardware. They're not really a hardware company as much as they're now a blend of hardware and software. That's also true of Google. It's also true of Amazon. It's also true of Microsoft. So you start to see a pattern. The companies have a hardware product, operating system, digital services, applications, developer tools, a billing system, network access. That's the whole stack. They can choose where to take their margin. So Amazon will make hardware cheap, but they'll make money on the transactions. Google makes money on the data and the advertising, but they make the hardware cheap. Apple prefers to get rich margins off of their hardware, the highest margins ever seen in a consumer electronics product, but they don't make as much money on the software. Each company has a different approach. So there's room for strategic diversity, but they're all operating off of the same template. What's happening to traditional businesses that don't have that software piece, like a car company, for example, they're focused only on the hardware. That's all they've got. Well, when you're bargaining against a company that can do the whole stack, you're at a disadvantage if all you have is the physical product.
Well, let's move on now because we only have a couple of minutes left in the show.
Right.
And there's a very interesting chapter at the end of the book about transhumanism. And that's where the ultimate evolution of computers meets human.
Right.
What happens? We only got about a minute left.
Oh gosh, all right. Well, someone said to me, what happens, what replaces the smartphone? Will that get vaporized? And a lot of people think maybe it's a wearable, a watch, something that you wear on your wrist. But actually, I don't think that's the case. What replaces the smartphone, I think, will be an implant of some sort. And I know people who are developing a thing called the Cortical Modem that connects directly to your brain. It seemed like a crazy idea, and in the book I describe it that way. I'm like, you're not going to believe this, but if you were to be able to basically transport your consciousness to some other substrate, then you could get rid of the human body. You could vaporize ourselves, right? You wouldn't just vaporize the phone. You would be the machine. You would be the car in the future. I know that sounds nuts, but there's actually thousands of people who are working on this. And I talked to some of them, and that's what the last chapter of Vaporized is about.
15 seconds. Okay. Virtual reality.
Yeah.
Is it a good thing for us to be indulging in virtual reality, or is it more like the bread and circuses in Rome to distract the people?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? So for the entertainment industry, VR is the next frontier. They're all excited about it. So speaking as a Southern Californian, I welcome VR. I think it'll be great. But my friends who are focused on artificial intelligence said, it's a good thing we have VR coming, because just as the time around it when it matures in about 10 years, that's when AI will be displacing so many human workers that we won't have anything else to do. VR will be what we fill up our hours of our day with, these virtual worlds. That's kind of a dark vision in my view.
Well, I'm sorry to have to end on that dark vision, but we've run out of time. But thank you so much for being here today.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Dave.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.